Hooey! Action heroes of history, Joe Petrosino. Joe Petrosino, early New York City super cop. He was a pioneer in the fight against organized crime. To say that he was a real-life action hero is not an exaggeration. All that tough guy stuff you see in the movies, Joe actually did. And he did it in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Joe did a lot with disguises and undercover work. He also favored a rough brand of justice and didn't mess around with criminals. He got the job done, and besides the fact that he beat up bad guys like a religion, he was actually a nice guy. He did what he did for the best possible reason and made a positive impact on the world because of it. Joe's beginnings. Joe was born as Giuseppe Petrosino in 1860 in present-day Italy. When Joe was very young, he was sent with his cousin to live with his grandfather in New York City. Sadly, Joe's grandfather was killed by a streetcar, and the future of the two boys looked uncertain. Good fortune smiled upon them, however, when they were taken in by an affluent Irish household for some time. This opened up educational and employment opportunities not available to recent immigrants of the time, especially Italians. By 1874, when Joe was 14, the rest of the Petrosino family had immigrated to the United States. In 1878, at the age of 18, Joe and his family became official U.S. citizens. It was that same year that young Joe went to work for the city as a street cleaner. This job was not sexy, but it did get him into the police department in a rather weird way. Alexander, the Clubber, Williams, was a colorful character for the NYPD. He was a captain who got bounced around a lot from precinct to precinct. He was very big into busting up organized crime and police corruption. The same year Joe started as a street cleaner, Clubber was put in charge of the street cleaning department. Something about Joe Petrosino's demeanor caught Clubber's attention. He saw a natural leadership ability. He enlisted the aid of Joe as an informant and interpreter in cases involving Italians. Joe was so good at this that Clubber urged his superiors to hire Joe as a patrolman. Joe joins the force. Joe Petrosino joined the New York Police Department on October 19, 1883. Before we go too much farther, there are some things about Joe you need to know. I say he was a super cop, and indeed he was. But if you're expecting him to look anything like Dwayne Johnson or other movie heroes, you're in for a surprise. Joe was short, fat, and although he wasn't ugly, he wasn't a pretty boy by any means. He was scrappy and had a brilliant detective mind. Joe was only 5'3" and 4 inches short of the force's height requirement. However, it was very clear early on that the man had skills. Through Clubber's urging, and the fact that the higher-ups really wanted Joe on the team, the height requirement was overlooked. He was the first Italian language speaker in the NYPD's history. He was also fluent in several Italian dialects. Joe had a talent for solving cases that other officers could not, especially in the Italian community. To make himself appear taller, Joe wore thick-soled shoes and, when in plain clothes, a tall derby hat. The hat became a trademark for Joe, and he was often referred to by newsmen as the detective in the derby. Joe and Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, future President of the United States, was a member of the Council of Police Commissioners that governed the NYPD. Joe and Teddy were friends. On July 20th, 1895, almost 12 years after Joe joined the force, he was promoted by Teddy to Detective Sergeant of the Homicide Division. In March of 1901, Teddy Roosevelt became Vice President to President William McKinley. In September of that same year, Teddy became President when McKinley was assassinated. Teddy Roosevelt became one of the most popular and well-liked presidents in American history. He carved out a nice legacy for himself, but he never forgot Joe Petrosino. Teddy is famous for being fearless, and he said that Joe did not know the name of fear. Saved from the electric chair. There are so many interesting cases in the career of Joe Petrosino, But one of his greatest successes was the Angelo Carbone case. Joe saved an innocent man from the electric chair just a little over a week before he was set to be executed. Here's how the case breaks down. It was at night on September 12, 1897. The location was Manhattan's Baxter Street. A man named Angelo Carbone was arrested for stabbing Natal Brogno. Carbone appeared to be very guilty. After all, he was standing over the man with a bloody knife. Brogno would die half an hour later at the hospital, and Carbone was charged with first-degree murder. In the middle of December, a rushed trial found Carbone guilty. The entire trial, including jury deliberations, only took 8 hours. Soon after, Carbone was sentenced to die in the electric chair at the infamous Sing Sing prison. He didn't have long. The execution was set for February 7th, 1898. Joe Petrosino didn't like anything about how the case or the trial was handled. First of all, Carbone admitted to fighting with Brogno, but insisted he was innocent of murder. Carbone's 12-year-old nephew said he saw another man run from the crime scene when Brogno collapsed. The coroner himself believed the knife that Carbone held was too small to be the murder weapon. Petrosino, when assigned to the case, quickly concluded that there was a missing murder weapon and murderer. It was pretty early on in his investigation that Joe was tipped off about Alessandro Ciarmello, and that it was he who fled the crime scene. Alessandro was a 51-year-old cousin of Carbone, and it was said that he was hiding in Dover, Delaware. Detective Joe hit the road and was hot on the trail of Alessandro for nearly a month. He traveled through Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland. Everywhere Alessandro went, he bragged to people that he killed Brogno. On January 26th, Joe caught up with the fugitive in Baltimore, Maryland. The man admitted his guilt, provided Joe with the murder weapon, and agreed to return to New York. But why did Alessandro kill Brogno in the first place? In July of 1897, the older man caught Brogno with his wife. On September 4th, the two men had a fight, but Alessandro lost. After all, Brogno was younger and bigger than him. Just 8 days later, when he spotted his cousin and Brogno fighting on the street corner, he jumped into it. With his own knife, Alessandro quickly stabbed the man twice in the side and ran away. By the time he was caught, Alessandro was willing to take his cousin's place in the electric chair. Instead, the murderer got life in prison, and Carbone got released. The Black Hand. If the Black Hand sounds scary, that's because it was. What was the Black Hand? To simplify things, the Black Hand was the early version of the Mafia. It was a brutal bunch of Italian criminals that did many terrible things with a focus on extortion and protection rackets. If our hero, Joe Petrosino, had an arch nemesis, it would be the Black Hand. What made this so personal for Joe? When he was a kid, there were fewer than 20,000 Italians in New York City. By the time he reached adulthood, there were over 500,000. Crowded living conditions can bring out the worst in people. Sadly, too many of the Italian immigrants had criminal tendencies to begin with. It really upset Joe to see so many Italians preying on their own kind. As an honest, law-abiding Italian immigrant, he looked down on these lawbreakers and thought they were a disgrace to decent Italians. But how did the Black Hand even start? It was largely the invention of New York's first Italian crime family. It was started by the Morellos, along with any assortment of their relatives and in-laws. A key figure in this group was Ignazio Lupo, better known as Lupo the Wolf. He married into the family. Lupo the Wolf was only in his early 20s when he started his criminal career back in Palermo, Italy. He killed a man, fled to New York, and started an American branch of the Black Hand. What Joe discovered about the Black Hand is that it wasn't quite as big and organized as a lot of people believed. There were big gangs, like the Morello family, but also a lot of scrubby little gangs that all liked to claim they were Black Hand. An advantage to Joe knowing the Italian language and all the different dialects was that he was able to study the various messages they sent to people and know that they came from different sources. Not only that, but the Black Hand insignia had many variations from one letter to another. Lupo the Wolf wasn't the only focus for Joe Petrosino, but was a pretty big focus where the Black Hand was concerned. Lupo was New York City's leading terrorist. His gang ran extortion and counterfeiting rackets in Manhattan. The tactics of Lupo's gang, or anyone calling themselves Black Hand, were straightforward: pay or die. Those who didn't comply were tortured and or killed. This punishment was also extended to their friends and relatives. For instance, tongues would be cut, fingers would be cut off, homes and shops would be blown up. This was serious stuff, and the bad guys were playing for high stakes. Joe was an honest man, completely incorruptible. It's fair to say that he hated the Black Hand with the red-hot passion of the sun. A further frustration for Joe was the fact that the courts were way too lenient with these terrible criminals, promptly releasing men he spent countless hours hunting down. This made him very hard and ruthless when it came to dealing with gangster types. Joe roughed up a lot of bad criminals while interrogating them. They carried bruises and scars for months. If the courts let these bad men back out in the streets, and they often did, Joe did everything he could to make their lives miserable. He arrested these thugs whenever he could for any offense, harassed their friends and customers, anything it took to get them to move away. This often worked. Joe Petrosino versus Lupo the Wolf. Lupo the Wolf was a terrible human being, no doubt about it. People trembled at the mention of his name. Being in his crosshairs was not a good place to be. What did Joe Petrosino think when he became a target of Lupo the Wolf? Joe was not to be intimidated, especially by someone he thought of as nothing more than a low-life punk. A common practice among crime bosses is to cover up illegal activities behind legitimate businesses. Lupo had grocery stores. A lot of them. They were actually considered very high-end. It wasn't just a front. He tried to make money the legal way too. However, he would fund his lofty ambitions with stolen money. Everybody knew the things Lupo did, but proving it in a court of law was another matter. Even when it was proven, the punishment would never be suitable for all his wrongdoing. Lupo was suspected of at least 60 murders and may have killed many more. There were 2 murders in which Lupo was greatly implicated but never charged. The first of these was in 1902. Lupo was the last person seen with Joe the Grocer Catania. The next day, Catania's body was found stabbed to death and stuffed in a potato sack in Brooklyn. Catania was suspected of blabbing about a counterfeit operation in which he was involved with Lupo to his neighbors and friends. In 1903, Lupo was suspected of the first barrel murder in New York. The victim was Madonia Benedetto, another Black Hand criminal. He had been stabbed 18 times in the neck, with his throat cut ear to ear. Madonia's body was then folded up and stuffed in a sugar barrel. Although Lupo was greatly believed to be behind the hit, it was an enforcer named Tommaso Petto, also known as Petto the Ox, who was charged with the killing. In 1904, Petto was released due to lack of evidence, but he was assassinated in 1905. All of this was very frustrating for Joe Petrosino. He really wanted to get something to stick on Lupo. Lupo wasn't even as smart or sneaky as some of the mobsters he had already put away. Years pass, as they often do. Joe continued his war on crime, particularly against the Black Hand. To list all of his achievements in this area would be almost impossible. Needless to say, he made many arrests, busted up many rackets, and put away a lot of gangsters for keeps. Lupo the Wolf, however, always seemed to elude justice. Death threats from the Black Hand were made against Joe Petrosino by the hundreds. Lupo the Wolf made many threats directly towards Joe. This was not wise on Lupo's part, considering the fact that his mere existence angered Joe. One day in October of 1908, things came to a head. Lupo was in desperate need of cash and was going heavy on his old, reliable extortion racket. Joe Petrosino decided to pay Lupo a very public visit with lots of witnesses. Joe walked up to Lupo and said something to him in a low voice. We don't know what he said, but we can only imagine it was some cool, dirty, hairy kind of stuff. After that, Joe sank his fist into Lupo's face and knocked him to the floor. We know Joe gave Lupo a savage beating. The details of what all went on have always been fuzzy. The biggest legend is that Joe beat Lupo the Wolf within an inch of his life, then dragged him over to an ash barrel in the middle of the street. According to this version, Joe dumped the unconscious Lupo face down in the barrel for everyone to see. It's not absolutely proven that this part of the story is fact, but we would like to think it is. What did come out of Joe beating Lupo senseless is that Lupo lost a lot of his power and standing in the community. He couldn't scare people quite as much as he did before because it was shown that he could be beaten. Lupo still owed a lot of money to his creditors, so much so that he was forced to flee New York City for a while. In December 1908, as a last act of defiance, Lupo ordered $50,000 worth of groceries on credit and had them shipped to a warehouse in Hoboken, New Jersey. From there, he was going to have the groceries shipped to Sicily and sold over there. Joe Petrosino followed the paper trail, however, tracked down the groceries, and had them impounded. This cut off another line of ill-gotten cash for the evil Lupo the Wolf. Yay, Joe! What happened to Lupo the Wolf? Even though this is Joe Petrosino's video, you might be curious to know what happened to Lupo the Wolf. After all, we've talked about him quite a bit. Although Joe couldn't get Lupo killed or put away for life, he did throw a monkey wrench into the man's criminal empire from which he would never fully recover. By the end of October 1908, the same month that Lupo got beaten up, the Murillo crime family was back in the counterfeiting business. This is what ultimately led to Lupo's major downfall as a top crime boss. In 1910, Lupo the Wolf was arrested for counterfeiting by the Secret Service. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, although he only served 10. According to the conditions of his parole, Lupo wasn't supposed to have any criminal associations at all. He totally did. He still ran rackets. This changed in the early 1930s. The infamous gangster Lucky Luciano and his national crime syndicate had a meeting with Lupo the Wolf. Luciano and his group were a lot smoother than Lupo. They preferred to use bribery first. Lupo relied entirely on violence and terror. Luciano didn't like Lupo's tactics because they generated too much heat from the police. Lupo was forced to give up almost all of his rackets, save for a small Italian lottery in Brooklyn. Officially, Lupo had been demoted to bottom feeder status in the world of the mafia. In 1936, Lupo formed a protection racket involving bakers. He was sent back to prison to serve more time on his original counterfeiting sentence. After his release from prison in 1946, he returned to Brooklyn where he died, practically an unknown, in 1947. At the time of his death, Lupo the Wolf was nowhere near as fearsome as he had been at the turn of the century. Joe Petrosino, New York City's super cop, was a legendary crime buster in his own lifetime. He was as tough as he was smart, and earned himself the nicknames of the Italian Sherlock Holmes and the Detective in the Derby. Joe lived a life of constant danger, but he couldn't have done it alone. Who were the other people that factored into Joe's life? The Italian Squad. Joe Petrosino had worked his way up the ladder in the police department and became a renowned detective. However, the challenges were becoming greater. A wild rash of bombings had terrorized Italian neighborhoods. In January 1905, Police Commissioner William McAdoo decided to form the city's first Italian Squad. What was the Italian Squad? If cops could be superhero teams, the Italian Squad would have been one of them. It was a 5-man squad of Italian-speaking super sleuths. McAdoo put Joe Petrosino in charge of the Italian Squad. One of them was actually French, but he was fluent in the Sicilian tongue. Joe was able to use his undercover talents more than ever before because he had a team to back him up. The things he learned were truly eye-openers in his fight against the Black Hand. Unlike a lot of other policemen, then and now, Joe Petrosino didn't totally shy away from the press. As a matter of fact, he wanted people to know what was going on as long as it didn't interfere with his investigations. Joe found out that the main reason New York City was getting overrun with Black Hand criminals is that Italian officials were granting passports to their nation's criminals, exporting their problem to the United States. Joe called on the federal government to track down these undesirable immigrants and send them back to Italy. Italy was dumping their trash on America. That's not cool. The Italian squad was fighting a never-ending wave of extremely bold thugs who showed no boundaries with their extortion rackets, bombings, kidnappings, murders, and that's the short list. In January 1906, a new police commissioner took over. His name was Theodore Bingham. At this time, Joe Petrosino was being criticized by some city officials for his brutal methods of interrogation. Just to be clear, it's usually not okay for a cop to act that way. However, Joe wasn't dealing with harmless pickpockets, shoplifters, or other petty criminals. Joe and the Italian squad were dealing with the worst kind of human trash. People who actually killed their own close family members over money, among all the other terrible things they did. This was war. Joe was also combating a lot of corruption with the police department, city officials, and the courts. If these people weren't taking bribes to neglect their duties, they were certainly letting criminals skate by out of fear. Police Commissioner Bingham defended Joe Petrosino. Not only that, but in November 1906, Bingham expanded the Italian squad into the Italian Legion. Joe went from having 4 men under his command to 25 men in Manhattan. An associated office of the Italian squad, Legion, was created in Brooklyn. Another super cop, Detective Sergeant Antonio Vacris, was in charge of 10 men. Joe Petrosino in the Italian Legion was like the NYPD's version of the Secret Service, or like the later FBI and CIA. Joe and his boys only reported to Commissioner Bingham. Now that he had a small army, Joe felt confident enough to move up against 2 of the top Italian crime bosses in America. The first of these 2 big targets was Enrico Alfano in April 1907. He was the leader of his own gang of murderers. Joe Petrosino arrested Alfano personally, who put up quite a struggle. That's okay because it looked good in the press. Alfano was later tried and convicted in Italy and given a lengthy sentence. The second gangster in Joe's crosshairs was Raffaele Palazzolo. This guy was a lot slicker than Alfano. In his native Italy, he was a dominant figure in the criminal underworld, and he was involved with politics. In 1893, Palazzolo killed a political opponent. He wasn't charged for this crime until 1899. He was convicted in 1902 and sentenced to 30 years. However, he succeeded in winning a new trial and was acquitted in 1904. We can only speculate how he won his second trial. Palazzolo decided to come to America in 1908. Although he was really no good, and everyone knew he had Black Hand Mafia connections, Palazzolo received a hero's welcome wherever he went. He was that high profile. Joe Petrosino and his squad had to tread lightly where Palazzolo was concerned. Obviously, they were going to investigate him. Publicly, Joe told the press that he accepted Palazzolo was not a criminal leader. What the crime boss didn't know is that Joe was having him watched. When Palazzolo made contact with the local mob, Joe paid him a visit. On this occasion, Joe did not want the press around or a lot of witnesses. Without incident, he convinced Palazzolo that it was time for him to go back home. The great crime leader sailed back to Italy less than 2 months after he arrived. It would be interesting to know what Joe told this guy or what he had on him. The love life of Joe Petrosino. Joe Petrosino neglected his personal life in favor of his career. He knew what he was doing was way too dangerous for a wife and children to be involved. After the Italian Legion was established, Joe felt it was a bit safer to have a family. Joe's favorite hangout was a restaurant owned by his friend Vincenzo Salino. He liked the food, and if it was a good day, he would even play cards with Salino. However, there was another reason Joe liked coming there. Salino had a daughter named Adelina Vinti. She was 11 years younger than Joe. She had also been previously married, but was widowed for some time. They had at least a 2-year courtship. Adelina didn't speak much English, so they conversed in Italian. Joe had wanted to marry Adelina for some time. Although Joe and Salino were friends, Salino initially objected to the wedding. It was no secret that Joe was a moving target for every criminal lowlife in New York City, and there were many. Salino did not want his daughter to be a widow again, at least not so soon. In addition, there was a strong possibility that she could have been killed just because she was Joe's wife. When Joe was promoted to lieutenant, he used the occasion to propose to Adelina. She said yes. This time Salino agreed, although we could be sure it was with some reluctance. It might have helped matters that Adelina's mother, Maria, was in favor of the wedding and finally swayed her husband. It was in April of 1907 that Joe Petrosino married Adelina Vinti. In attendance was the Italian squad and Commissioner Bingham. It's important to state that Adelina did not go into this marriage blind. She knew the reality of the situation given Joe's line of work. Therefore, she had to believe in the importance of what he was doing. They moved into a 4-room apartment. Sadly, the newly married couple did not go on a honeymoon. There were a couple reasons. For one, it wasn't safe. There were too many bad men lying in wait, ready to ace Joe at the first opportunity. Second, a honeymoon would have taken Joe away from his work for too long. Although it was a big Italian squad and an even bigger Italian legion, a lot of things hinged on Joe's leadership. Adelina spent most of her time at home and did not go out much. It's easy to see that this was not an easy life, but they must have made the most of what time they had together. In November of 1908, the Petrosinos had a daughter, also named Adelina. Although Joe and Adelina were very happy together, Joe started to suffer from anxiety. He had not been quite so paranoid before about assassins. Now it seemed a lot more real. You didn't want to sneak up on Joe, not even as a joke. Joe reacted very fast if he thought there was a threat. One time, he beat up a reporter he mistook for a hitman. Joe felt bad about that, but people learned not to pounce on him. This anxiety must have affected his health. In the summer of 1908, while his wife was pregnant, Joe was sick with bronchial pneumonia for a couple months. For a while, he wasn't at police headquarters. As soon as he got better, however, he got back to work. The Black Hand strikes back. Outwardly, everything appeared to be tops in the world of Joe Petrosino. He was highly revered by the law-abiding citizens of New York City. Kids around the city looked at him like he was a god. At home, he had a great wife and a new baby daughter. Adelina was accommodating to her husband's extremely dangerous profession. Although death threats are never pleasant, she had learned to live with them. Not every wife would be as understanding. Career-wise, Joe was the lieutenant of an elite squad of detectives. The only man he had to report to, Commissioner Bingham, was incredibly cooperative. Joe could basically do his job any way he saw fit. As it turns out, he was incredibly effective. The Italian Legion wiped out 50% of organized crime in the city. This was an incredible achievement considering the fact that the threat had been so great for so long. It was early 1909 when a new federal law was passed. This law allowed the U.S. government to deport any alien who had lived in America for less than 3 years if that alien had been convicted of a crime in another country. This was a law that Joe Petrosino and other law enforcement officials had been waiting for. It was the same law that would send Joe on the mission of his life. Joe had a long list of known criminals who were recent immigrants to the country. His assignment? Go to Italy and collect enough information proving that these criminals had already been convicted in Italy. That would allow the U.S. government to send a lot of these bad guys packing for keeps. Needless to say, this was going to be highly dangerous. Not even Joe Petrosino knew how dangerous this mission was going to be. You know how the media is almost entirely terrible nowadays? It was the same way in 1909. From the very beginning, there were signs that the secrecy and the success of the mission was in peril. Somebody was giving out too much information. Was there a leak in the police department? A spy? Neither the police or the U.S. government was doing anything to stop the press from releasing details of Joe's activities. While Joe was en route to Italy, he still thought the mission was being kept a secret from everybody. On the whole, this affair was handled very badly. The Black Hand in Italy knew Joe Petrosino was coming. Joe didn't know that they knew until he got there. Although Joe was an exceptional undercover cop and good with disguises, even the U.S. ambassador in Italy, Lloyd Griscom, told Joe directly that he would be recognized in Sicily by perhaps 1,000 criminals. No disguise is good enough if you're suspected in the first place. When Joe was in Rome, even he knew he was being followed. This is extremely peculiar. Joe Petrosino had always been an exceptionally intelligent and cautious policeman. It seems odd that he would walk into a situation he knew was a trap, especially since his anxiety and paranoia of being assassinated were at an all-time high. The man was fearless for sure, but he wasn't stupid. Joe should have turned back and sent someone in later who was a lot less high profile. Was Joe getting careless? Or was something else driving him? To say Joe had stepped into the lion's den is most appropriate, if the lions had guns, knives, and bombs. On March 12, 1909, Joe Petrosino was to meet an informant in Palermo, Sicily. It was 9 o'clock at night. He had just eaten at a restaurant called Cafe Areto. Afterwards, he met this informant at the iron fence of the great Garibaldi Garden. Instead, it was 2 men sent to kill him. Joe Petrosino was shot 4 times. It depends on where you read the details, but at least one of the shots was in his face. Joe didn't die right away, and he desperately clung to life. An Italian sailor, hearing the gunshots, came to his aid, but it was too late. According to the New York Times, Joe was armed with a revolver and fired off a shot in vain. However, William Bishop, who was the American consul at Palermo, straight up told the New York Times and everyone else that Joe Petrosino was not armed. In fact, Joe had left his Smith & Wesson handgun back in his hotel room. I think it was incredibly odd for Joe to leave his gun behind. Then again, a lot of what went on with Joe's fatal mission doesn't make sense. The only items on Joe's body included his badge, a gold watch and chain, some banknotes and checkbook, and postcards addressed to his wife. The one thing we do know is that news of Joe Petrosino's murder spread fast. Real fast. Not very many news stories spread so fast back in 1909. Keep in mind this was long before radio, television, and internet. Joe was both that beloved by the general public and hated by the criminal underworld that such a crime wasn't going to be ignored. The murder mystery of Joe Petrosino. No one claimed to recognize the two men who fled from the scene of Joe Petrosino's murder. There were many suspects, and they were all investigated. Sadly, Joe's murder remains officially unsolved. What was the specific reason for Joe Petrosino's murder? Did there need to be one? He was universally hated by every Black-Hand criminal. Any fish, big or small, wanted to take a bite. There were lots of theories and lots of talk. One such theory is that the hit was ordered by Lupo the Wolf. I talked about Lupo the Wolf quite a bit in Joe Petrosino 2. Click on the link below to watch that video. Joe gave Lupo the beating of his life about half a year earlier, so it's easy to understand his motive. The aftermath of murder. Joe's funeral was held in New York City on April 12, 1909, exactly 1 month after his death. It is estimated that anywhere from 200,000 to 250,000 people showed up. It was quite a spectacle. Joe's wife, Adelina, was totally inconsolable and couldn't stop crying. Their daughter was only 5 months old and would never get to know her father. His friends and fellow officers were in shock. Teddy Roosevelt, one-time police commissioner who helped Joe's career in the early days and former president of the United States, had this to say. Petrosino was a great man, a good man. I knew him for years, and he did not know the name of fear. He was a man worthwhile. I regret most sincerely the death of such a man as Joe Petrosino. The Italian Legion died with Joe Petrosino and was disbanded. It never should have gone away, but that was the workings of police administrators at the time. Politics. The Black Hand was still a serious threat, however, and a new Italian squad was formed under Michael Fiaschetti. He was a young detective, mentored by Joe Petrosino very late in the run of the original Italian squad. At one point, Fiaschetti even went to Italy to try to solve Petrosino's murder. It was personal for him. Although he was able to solve a lot of crimes and put a lot of bad guys away, he could never bring closure to the Petrosino case. A lot of things factored into it, but the Italian squad was shut down once again in late 1922, this time for keeps. Life wasn't easy for Adelina Petrosino and her daughter. They were hounded out of Little Italy by her husband's criminal enemies and moved to Bay Ridge, Brooklyn with family. Both Adelina and her daughter Adelina collected and preserved anything associated with Joe. They assembled quite an archive of memorabilia. The love was always there. Joe's wife lived until 1957, aged 88. Joe's daughter lived until 2004, aged 94. Joe's only grandchild, Susan Burke, became the spokesman for all things Joe Petrosino for many years. A lot of bad stuff came out of Joe Petrosino's death. But what good came from it? For one thing, the NYPD came down on Black Hand criminals harder than they ever had before. It wasn't a good thing to have the full attention of the police. It forced organized crime to become a lot more organized and slicker. The Black Hand pretty much faded out of existence by the 1920s in favor of what we now know as the Mafia, La Cosa Nostra. Newer guys like Al Capone in Chicago and Lucky Luciano in New York had taken over. These were not good guys either, but they had boundaries. Killing cops was deemed an absolute no-no for all the heat it would generate. For the most part, even regular citizens could breathe easier. Mobsters stuck largely to killing other mobsters. Not being killed by a mobster was relatively easy. You just stayed out of their world as much as possible. Joe Petrosino's martyrdom, at the very least, brought some needed change to how criminals operated. The legacy of Joe Petrosino. Joe Petrosino's memory lived on strong for much of the 20th century. He was immortalized in almost all media, including career retrospectives in newspapers, films, books, comic books, and television. Some are truthful, some are fictionalized. Do yourself a favor, stick with the nonfiction. Joe Petrosino's real life story is so much more interesting. In 1987, a small triangular park in lower Manhattan was changed from Kenmare Square to Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino Square. He has an exhibit in the Italian-American Museum in Manhattan's Little Italy. It might seem strange, but Joe Petrosino is celebrated more in Italy than in America. He has graced their media a lot. Joe has his own museum in Padula, his birthplace. In 2003, a small memorial was placed where he was murdered. In 2010, Italy even gave Joe Petrosino his own stamp. Joe Petrosino deserves to be remembered, especially in America. People need to know that policemen like him existed. Without question, he was a true action hero of history.